Today's episode is a special one, so we'll check out two brilliant methods we can use to get rich quickly thanks to our neighbors. This is partly a continuation of exploring the easiest ways to make money in Farming Simulator 25. The second method will even require us to interact with our neighbors, but let's start at the beginning with something that surprisingly still works. Flipping fields. Let's see how much we can earn with this method in a year. For those unfamiliar, it works like this. You buy a field that already has crops growing and ready to harvest, collect the crops, and sell the field at exactly the same price, regardless of whether something is still growing on it. This is because field prices are fixed, so let's get started. I rented one of the largest harvesters in the game along with the biggest header. I rented it because buying this setup would have left me with virtually nothing, and we need a decent amount of free cash to actually flip these fields. There were some issues because I couldn't send a worker to the field, so I had to drive the harvester myself. I was worried the harvester with the header on wheels attached wouldn't fit on the ferry, but thankfully it made it without major complications. Once I arrived, I hired a worker right away. We're harvesting oats, which produce straw, but collecting straw isn't exactly the easiest task since workers won't do it for you. And after all, this is supposed to be an easy method, so we're skipping the straw. I bought probably the smallest plot on this map for just over 25,000 and built a fairly large silo on it because we'll be selling the crops at the highest prices to maximize profit, which means we need storage to hold the crops until then. The game developers will probably never create a perfectly functioning worker that isn't completely clueless. For example, here the worker was harvesting a part of the field he'd already harvested himself. I already bought a truck and trailer to avoid getting eaten up by leasing costs. Although the lease for the truck and trailer was minimal since they'll mostly be stationary, I still decided to buy them. Am I the only one bothered by the gap between the truck cabin and the trailer? I know it can be adjusted, but I didn't notice it before. We managed to harvest the field fairly quickly. Not surprising, given we're using the largest setup available. We sold the harvested field and bought another one. The process went pretty quickly, but when I tried to sell the field, a problem arose. As it turned out, it wasn't a problem at all, just an extra 1,000 for selling some shed on the field. I rushed to the next field, which was practically next to my silo, so I saved some time on transport. Why is this harvester driving across the field instead of along it? I harvested and harvested, sold and bought, but just by looking at it, this business wouldn't have made me much profit. The problem was that I was mainly harvesting oats and wheat, and to maximize profit from these grains, you have to collect straw, which accounts for up to 50% of the earnings from these crops. If you want to learn more about the profitability of crops, I've made a very detailed video on the topic. Because of this, I finally went to sleep and fast-forwarded time to November as I had spotted a massive soybean field ready for harvest. I emptied the harvester of the remaining wheat, and when I tried to buy the soybean field after selling the previous one, to my surprise, I was 60,000 short. I thought I might have another field somewhere, but unfortunately, leasing costs had eaten into my funds. I couldn't pass up on that soybean field, so I decided to sell some oats, which were priced fairly high at the time. While January is the peak for oats, selling them in November didn't result in a huge loss. I sold an entire trailer of oats and even a little extra to have a small buffer for lease payments. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough because as I rushed to the field, my account suddenly emptied, most likely due to lease fees. I had to go back and sell even more oats. After these complications, I finally managed to harvest that massive soybean field, and that's where I decided to end my field flipping adventure. I returned the harvester and header, fast-forwarded time to January to sell oats and wheat at their peak prices, and then skipped ahead to July to sell the soybeans. Altogether, I ended up with just over $744,000 in my account. Adding the value of the truck, trailer, house, silo, and the field, the total profit came to a little over $127,000. However, it took me nearly 4.5 hours, which is quite a long time. This method is absolutely fine because it gives us pure profit without having to bother with sowing and preparing fields. I could have earned even twice as much if I had bought the harvester instead of renting it, as I noticed that I spent nearly $100,000 on lease payments in the first day alone. On the other hand, I wouldn't have been able to buy a large harvester, as I wouldn't have had enough money left to purchase large fields. That would have meant the whole process would take me twice as long, a kind of vicious cycle. Either way, choosing grains where straw accounts for 50% of the profits was definitely a bad decision. All things considered, this method is absolutely profitable, but is it fair? That's a question question everyone has to answer for themselves. But if someone thinks and has decided that the previous method was unfair, this one takes it even further. While we do incur penalties here, in the end, we still come out ahead. This involves borrowing crops from our neighbors through contracts. The scheme is simple. Start a contract, collect the crops into your own silo, and then complete the contract while incurring a penalty that's lower than what you'll earn from selling the crops at the highest prices. The only question is, how profitable is this? Let's find out. The first contract is taken, so off I go with the harvester to the field. I mainly target crops that can be stored in silos to avoid dealing with conveyors or other machinery. Right away, I picked up a second contract with an almost identical set of equipment. I'm not sure if this was a glitch or if the worker was really that incompetent, but as before, I had to deliver the harvester to the field myself because the worker refused to do it. You can have a maximum of 3 active contracts, so naturally I picked a third. This time the set of equipment was slightly smaller. I also decided to build a smaller silo, which by the way looks like it's straight out of a children's cartoon. With 3 contracts running simultaneously, there was a literal queue in front of the silo. Once a field was harvested, I finished the contract, collected the reward, or rather covered the penalty. Without much hesitation, I started another contract, this time on a large field with a big set of machines. Meanwhile, I spotted another job, also on a large field. In total, I took on 2 more contracts, during which I once again caught a worker getting stuck due to some buggy behavior. This time, a pole blocked the transport of the grain. To be honest, I was getting tired of dealing with grains. So after finishing nearly all the active contracts, I went to sleep to wait for something else. I eventually landed a contract for sorghum on a fairly large field, and after fast forwarding time, I found another job, this time on an even bigger field. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room in the storage, so I had to build another silo. This was probably a good sign since it meant there would be more money at the end. However, I had to cancel one of the large sorghum contracts. After exiting the game, the worker refused to continue from where they had left off and wanted to start from scratch. I wasn't gonna harvest it myself since this was supposed to be an easy way to earn money. Fortunately, I came across a contract for harvesting soybeans. I decided this would be my last mission in my adventure with borrowing crops from neighbors. I fast forwarded to January, rented a truck and trailer, though I could have bought them, I'm not sure why I didn't, and sold the sorghum, oats and wheat. Then I fast forwarded to July and sold the soybeans. In total, after deducting the costs of the silos, contracts and other expenses, I made just under 50,000. I spent only slightly less time on this than the previous method, but earned half as much. That's why I decided to do a follow-up, carefully analyzing how much we can earn from a solo contract. I chose a contract for harvesting cotton. The equipment, as usual, was standard, a self-propelled harvester assigned to the contract. Although the field was tiny, this is the only option for harvesting cotton in the game. There were some minor issues when trying to board the ferry. It seems nobody tested this with a cotton harvester, as for a moment I thought it wouldn't be possible. However, with perfect alignment, I barely managed to make it. Naturally, I faced similar issues when disembarking. After reaching the field, I hired a worker and waited for them to finish the harvest. Despite the small field, it took them a while. I decided to purchase a tractor with a specialized cotton loader to sell the bale. Of course, I waited for the best price, which was in March. Unfortunately, I didn't think to buy a front weight, which caused some complications while transporting the bale to the sell point. After a long and exhausting journey, I sold it for 14,776. Canceling the contract cost me nearly 1,000 less, so it wasn't exactly a fantastic profit. Some time ago, I recorded a short where I also tested this method on a cotton contract. Back then, it was more profitable, but I didn't harvest the entire field and stored the bale on my own property. So I decided to do one final test to determine if this method is still viable or if it's been nerfed in recent updates and is no longer worth it. I fast forwarded to cotton harvest season, but no contracts appeared. I decided to change to a map with mostly large fields. On the new map, I quickly found a contract for a massive cotton field. Interestingly, the contract included a truck for transportation, but I didn't plan to use it. The field was so large that harvesting it all would have taken several hours. Luckily, the plan was not to harvest the entire field. I harvested just one bale, and after unloading it, I dismissed the worker. This time, I purchased a slightly larger transportation setup with a front weight. I also bought a neighboring field to store the bale there. After transporting it, I fast forwarded to March. Then I set out to the sell point to see if it was worth it. Selling the cotton earned me just over 50,000, but the penalty for cancelling the contract was 55,000. On top of that, the worker took around 1,000, leaving me 6,000 in the red. It seems this method no longer works, unless you have some ideas on how to make it profitable. If you do, share your suggestions in the comments. The next episode is the one where I'll test the profitability of forestry, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. And right after that comes the episode everyone's been waiting for. See you soon.